Commencement is one of the most joyous occasions in the annual cycle of university life. It signifies the successful completion of a rigorous course of study and also the welcome of students into the university's body of alumni, those whose stewardship will determine the future vibrancy of an institution. I'm Bill Massey, Vice Chancellor for Alumni and Development at UNC Asheville. In our class of 2007, the university's trustees, faculty, and Dr. Ann Ponder conferred degrees upon 582 students. On May 12th, it was our pleasure in the spring commencement exercises to honor two distinguished citizens with honorary degrees. The first was Donald Sultan, an Asheville native and one of the inspired, brilliant visual artists of the latter part of the 20th century and early 21st century. Additionally, we conferred a degree upon Ernest J. Gaines, novelist and author of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, Lessons Before Dying, and A Gathering of Old Men, among others. We're delighted to share with you insight into both of these gentlemen through interviews that we conducted while they were here for the spring commencement exercises. I was delighted to conduct the first interview with Donald Sultan, an interview which took place at the Grove Park Inn. We're here at the Grove Park Inn to honor Donald Sultan, distinguished painter, Asheville native, and honorary degree recipient at this year's commencement ceremonies of the University of North Carolina at Asheville. Donald, welcome home.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for allowing the university to honor you in this particular way.
Well, it's my honor, really.
Thank you. It's been a while since you've been home, and certainly quite a few years since you were a child here in Asheville. And as you flew in today, and as you come back home to visit your mom on occasion, how is Asheville doing today compared to when you were growing up here?
Well, when I was growing up here, it was the fifth largest town in North Carolina. And it was a civic-minded town of small businesses and shops. And they had everything you would see in a small town life. They had the Christmas parades. We had the Mickey Mouse black and white cartoon festivals at the S&W. Everyone took the little diesel city buses, even from third grade home. And it's grown. It's gotten a lot bigger here. The downtown has changed now. The shopping malls have taken over the outsides. The life has come back to it since it's gone through several cycles. Mm-hmm. And now it looks like a new life has taken over here. And it reminds me a little bit of Berkeley in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. You certainly drew part of your inspiration for your work from your dad's work here. Your dad, who was a graduate of then the Asheville Biltmore College, a businessman here in town, but also an artist. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that distinguishes a good deal of your work today is a return to some of the materials that you grew up with in your dad's shop. Can you tell us about that?
Well, it's a funny thing. I never really thought of that when I was doing it. I think the biggest influence was growing up in a family of people who worked with their hands and worked on things, making things, and my father painting. But I was also involved here as a large community of theater people. Mm-hmm. And we had John Haber had the Tanglewood Children's Theater, which I was very active in. And then I segued that into the summer stock and around the country and learned to do set design and to make sets and to be on stage and to be around theater. So ultimately I combined the two. I made paintings that are basically on stages that are moved up to the wall and using materials that would be, I guess you would find them in the shop, but that wasn't really the intent, but it became much more of a physical way of working. I felt more comfortable with that kind of work than illustration. So I probably, you know, you combine these things, but it takes a long time to see the influences. Because, I mean, you could joke and say, since I used tar a lot, you could say that perhaps people had pointed out it was because it was a Tar Heel state. But I never really thought of that.
One could point that out.
And believe me, they have.
It's been said of your work as one of the leading American artists of the last half of the 20th century that you are best known for your ability to successfully merge the best of yesterday's artistic tradition with a fresh modern approach that is unique. How much of that is purposeful and how much of that is whatever artistic talent comes forward when you approach your art every day?
Well, there was a period where I was concerned about whether or not I could do anything new. And I came to the conclusion very early on that since I was new, it couldn't be otherwise. So then I stopped worrying about that, and I just began to think about what kind of painting I wanted to see. And I think all painting and all art really takes from the previous art history of the past. They take things from it, look at it, they mull it over, things that made you want to be an artist, things that catch your interest, the intelligence that goes into art, and you adapt it to what you're working on, the way you're working today. And the fact is that I did a lot of small still lifes, and people would say, well, how would they be different from a traditional still life? And I would say, well, there really isn't any different from the traditional still life made out of linoleum and rubber. So there actually, you could get rid of those questions rather quickly. And a lot of that just has to do, I think, with knowing in a way what you would like to see, what compels you, what is interesting to you. And I've found that most of the time it's what's around me. And I take from the things that are around me. If I'm in the city, when I first moved to this city, most of the images were industrial based. And then I began to use the interior of the studio, interior of rooms. I used materials that were industrial, that were city, that were urban. And I always tell the story of going to a dinner party when I had first moved to New York. And you know, you move to New York from a school or a college, and you know, I came from a small town really. I was well educated, but you know, basically kind of unused to levels of sophistication that you run into when you move into a kind of a high level of society in New York especially. And I was at a dinner party, and this woman had a beautiful table set with a circular floral pattern for the table that were red tulips. There must have been 24, and all of them were perfectly straight in a line like that. And I thought, that's fantastic. So I decided I would draw them. Of course, I would draw them with charcoal, which led a sooty, gritty way of looking at it. So I bought tulips and I put them in, and and they were drooping all over the place. I could never get them to stand up. And I thought she'd bought them to some special florist, you know. So I said, Catherine, where did you buy those tulips that were perfectly straight? They were unnatural. She said, well, I put wire in them. And I thought, but at any rate, I decided that the ones that were chaotic were better for my purposes. So I did this series of black tulips that launched a whole body of work. And it's just a lot of times it's the misunderstandings that lead you to something interesting.
Well, to say that your work is outstanding is an understatement. I mean, to have moved to New York in 1975, I believe, having achieved your BFA degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then studying at the Art Institute in Chicago, to have your first solo show in New York in 1977 is in itself a remarkable achievement. Some of our art students, Donald, asked me to ask you, when you have achieved the level of success that you have, and clearly you are one of America's distinguished artists of the last part of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. Your work is collected and exhibited here in our own Asheville Museum of Art and our North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. But additionally, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Whitney, and we could go on and on. How do you measure success?
Now, that's what the students ask. How do you measure success? I think you measure success primarily by your ability to do what you want to do and not have to do something else in order to do that. I think that's probably the best measure.
And so that would be advice that you might offer.
Yeah, because
as
I
well
don't
from
think
your
it
own life.
takes a great deal other than your desire to do what you want to do, and if you can somehow wrangle that so that you can make your paintings, and that's what you can do. It doesn't matter how much money you make or where you live. It doesn't even matter if anyone sees it. The point is, it has to be an obsession that you have, and that it's something you have to do. It's the art world is very different now than when I came into it. I'm sure everybody hears this over and over again. But we never thought of art as a career. We thought of it as a calling. And we didn't think that there was any way anyone could really make a living other than teaching. There was a few artists that made some money, but not very many. And so, like dancers, you know, in the ballet, they don't really make much money, but it's a passion that they have, and they have to do it. And that's the kind of the way painting is. The problem with painting is that you need to buy things. You need to have a place to work, and you need to have materials, and you have to do things like that. But you can pare down more or less your the things you need in order to achieve what you want. So I would say that that would be the kind of success you would want to achieve. The other things can actually get in the way. Once you get into a situation where people want things, it's demanding, there's demands on your time, there's a calling for your work, people want this, that people want that, people want to do this and that, that's distracting. And it's difficult to keep yourself growing and involved only in your own work and not to get sort of flat.
Well, that leads to another question that some of our students had of you. When I suggested to them the name Donald Sultan, artist, what are the things that you think about? And immediately came to mind not only your success as you have defined it, but extremely collectible in major collections of museums and corporations and individuals worldwide, commanding significant prices for original works and prints. And they probed, I think rather interestingly, about does that lock you into doing what you have done? Or are you, as an artist, as an individual, free to think, what's next? What is my next inspiration going to come? Where is my next inspiration going to come from? And how am I going to reflect that in my art?
Well, that's a question a lot of people ask in the beginnings of their careers or the beginnings of their work. What do they think up? You don't think up anything. You find it. So those kinds of things don't make you stay with one kind of thing, because the more you do it, the more the ideas you will get from the work itself as to where you're going to go. And you just keep following the work. In the beginning, when I was making abstract paintings, I never would have thought I would have ended up doing industrial landscapes made out of tar and linoleum. I thought they would be more field paintings and things like that. But I find myself every now and then scratching my head as looking at where I am and wondering, like, why did I get there?
Yeah. Well, if I may, I'll remind you of something you once said. You said the journey or the process of painting is as important as its destination or end result.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was explaining to a student once who was an intern from Boston, and she was watching me draw, and I was explaining to her that every gesture you make when you're drawing is a statement. It's not just a rendition. It's a statement beyond the thing you're doing. And that every time you put a pen to paper, you're looking past the image you're working on, and you're bending it to a particular will that you have seen that you want done. And that's one of the beauties of being able to do this, because you have invented your own will. And hopefully that would carry on.
Donald, Robert Tynes, a member of our art faculty, an art professor here at UNC Asheville, has commented to me several times that when he and others take students to New York, art students to New York, as part of their studies here, that you always have welcomed them and spent time with students, with those who have, at this point in their life, determined that art is going to be their career as well as their passion. And I wonder, aside from the fact that that we ask you to do that, what is it about seeing a next generation of aspiring artists who are at the point in their lives where you at one point happened to be? What is it as an artist that speaks to you, and as a human being, speaks to you about the opportunity to do that?
I don't really think of it that way. I see so many young artists. I mean, New York is a flood of young artists that are all at various stages of advancing the things they want to do in their work. And so when Robert asked to bring students to my studio, I do it because I think it's important for them to see someone in a studio that's working. I don't think there's too much more beyond that. They all have their own ideas, and sometimes they may be a little awed by it. But I never saw there was any possibility that artists actually had studios and worked on their work as full-time until I went to college. So, and then going to a professional artist studio was just something that never ever happened. I invented the whole thing myself, more or less. At the Art Institute, we would have visiting artists come, and I got to be very close with them. But I and a group of artists started our own gallery in Chicago called the Name Gallery, which was a cooperative of young artists that would show artists from all over the country and our own works, and was one of the first funded cooperative galleries. And up until about 5 years ago, it was still running. So we invented things very much like art. We invented what didn't exist. So I find that if artists come to see someone who's doing that, they will see, for example, that it's possible to do. And what one person can do, another can do. And so one hopes that they don't get, it's not just a visit, but that somewhere along the line someone will get the idea that this is something they want to do and that it can be done. So I enjoy that. And I enjoy Robert, and I enjoy just being able to be in that position to give them that opportunity to see that. I don't have a chance to be involved with each young person. I just do. It's a group.
Well, just for you to know, your mom is your surrogate in Asheville.
Right.
I can't imagine the opening of a student art show that your mother isn't prominently there and always in awe, in seeming awe of what she's seeing.
Yeah, well, I think the students are very talented.
Yeah.
I've seen some of those scholarship recipients, and I'm always amazed when I go to, my son is now at RISD, and I go I went back to the Art Institute with him to look at it, and to RISD, and I'm amazed at the creativity of these kids. Maybe we were like that. I don't know. I remember going to the Art Institute to look at it, to see if I would go there to graduate school, and seeing the foundation show, which at that time was held in the Art Institute, which is not anymore, but walking through the Art Institute and seeing the student work that could compete with any work was really astonishing to me. And it was really impressive. And I, sometimes you can get a little discouraged, but you don't.
Donald, I think part of your early professional career was encouraged by Arts Council grants, or state Arts Council grants. How important do you think state and federal support of the arts is today in the world of artistic endeavor?
Well, of course, grants by arts organizations are very important at all different stages of artists' careers. And the Guggenheim grant, the NEA, which doesn't do it anymore. New York State gives some small ones, but not very much. They're very important when you're starting out, and then they're very important in your mid-career. I've never applied for Guggenheim grant because I didn't ever really feel that I should take money that other people who needed it more could have. But I would love the honor of it. But one goes hand in hand, and I'm conflicted about that. But at the time, I had an NEA grant and actually a New York State Council of the Arts grant when I was just starting out. And that allowed me, I was working at a gallery, and the gallery was closing because they'd gone out of business. And it allowed me, those two grants allowed me to only work on my work full-time for whatever period the money lasted. And by that ability, I was able to begin to start a real foundation for a full-time career. So it's very important. And it's a great pity that we don't do it anymore.
As I read about you in preparation for our meeting today, I was struck by the synchronicity between the mission of UNC Asheville, which is the liberal arts, and exactly who you are, because you have been involved in the theater, a poet, a painter. I'm fascinated by your work with David Mamet, American playwright. Do all of these things just represent different expressions of the same self, or are you constantly kind of peeling the onion of how many different sides there are to you, or is this just who you are and you don't know how you came to it, but it is Donald Sultan?
Well, I think that's probably more right. I find myself being asked questions or asked to do things, and usually I do them if I want to. And for example, I've done a number of, as you mentioned with David, I've done a number of book cover jackets for him and stuff, but in truth I prefer to use images that I've already done, because when it comes to making a graphic or something, there are people who do it better than I do. So I know my limitations there. And when it comes to writing, I'm pretty good at that, and I believe that, like Wittgenstein, that anything that can be thought can be said clearly. And so you can be articulate about what you're doing if you're thinking clearly, if you're thinking about things. And I think I'll talk about a little bit of this in my commencement address. It's a short piece, but I talk a little bit about that intelligence is an enormous part of what goes into a work of art. And it's manifested in many ways. There's many kinds of intelligence, but it's something that one really needs to know a lot to go into a work of art. You need to know a lot about many things, and you need to know a lot about what it is you're putting in there, and more importantly, you need to know what not to put in there. And the thing about painting is that it's the only thing we know of that is an object that when it's made, it contains a spirit that doesn't leave when you're through with it. And it stays and gives it to you for the eternity of the life of the work of art, which is why we don't have old paintings, like old movies or old photographs. All paintings are contemporary. If you look at a Mannerist painting, you don't think of it as an old painting. You see it as a painting now, and it speaks to you in maybe in a different way, but it's hard for you to imagine the life of the people who made that painting then. You see it today, and it's the only thing like that. There's nothing else like it. There's no other object that does that. And painting, it's one of the miracles of painting. We don't know how it works, and it's something that I find just thrilling to be a part of. And that's what keeps one working on paintings, because each one of them gives you something that you don't get from something else.
Donald Sultan, it's such a pleasure to have you in Asheville for this special weekend at the University of North Carolina at Asheville.
Thanks.
Again, we thank you very much for allowing us to honor you with an honorary doctorate degree and to have you share some of the wisdom that you have accomplished over the years with our students. Time magazine said of Donald Sultan that he takes familiar shapes and rescales it, mainly his profile. One still life of an egg and 3 lemons on a plate that also happens to be 8 foot square. He slows up recognition and provokes a sense of strangeness. Donald, thank you so much for being with us, and we invite those who are viewing this program to see your work at the Asheville Art Museum, part of the permanent collection there, and elsewhere in North Carolina at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Certainly when we're visiting New York, the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our interview with Dr. Ernest Gaines is conducted by Wiley Cash, a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Asheville, who currently is pursuing his doctoral studies in literature at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette. Interestingly, Wiley Cash has as mentor, friend, and teacher Ernest Gaines, and we were particularly delighted that Wiley was able to return to his alma mater to interview his friend and mentor.
I'm Wiley Cash, and I'm here with author Ernest Gaines from Louisiana, author of A Lesson Before Dying and the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. And we're here in the Red Oak Conference Room of Ramsey Library in a May graduation in the year 2007. And Professor Gaines just spoke at UNCA's graduation, and he was gracious enough to join us today for an interview and for a little conversation after the ceremony. Professor Gaines, we first met in the fall of 2003, 4 years ago, when I took a workshop with you, and it was your final workshop. What was your experience like teaching at UL?
Well, I've been teaching there, it was 2003, I've been teaching there 20 years already, 21 years, because I started in 81. And one of the things I remember about my students was that I would always get attorneys, lawyers in my class. Well, I taught at night because I wanted to draw from the community as well as, from the students who were studying to become teachers or studying for the MFAs or whatever they were studying for. And besides the students who were studying for their degrees, I would always get those lawyers, and I had a lot of fun doing that because, and I like having them in the class because they had stories to tell, and they brought an experience that the students, they had not shared yet. So I liked having them around. So, but they were interesting students. They were great. Well, you were in their class, and we have some of our friends, some of your friends were in that class too. You see all the time. So we had a wonderful time.
Yeah. And what I always loved about the class, every week you'd say, at the end of class you'd say, okay, who's bringing the stories for next week? Okay, so-and-so, so-and-so. Who's bringing the cookies? And every week you would have like that meeting time in the middle for cookies, and that was a very serious thing.
Yeah, well, we would discuss 2 stories, 2 pieces of work each week. And after the first piece of work, a story or a chapter from a novel, we'd have a break. And then we'd have coffee and cake or cookies. Somebody got married or someone had a birthday or something like that, bring the cake there. And I thought it was sort of a good 15, 20-minute break for everybody. And then we'd start with the second hour and a half. So it's wonderful.
I remember one time in particular, there was a gentleman in our class who was a little older, and he had forgotten to bring cookies. And before class, he was going around borrowing money from people. And we said, well, you should have your own money. Why do you need money? He said, I forgot to bring cookies. I got to go down to the vending machine and buy some. And he went and cleaned out the vending machine with cookies and stuff and passed them around to everybody. Now that you're retired from the university, they still have the home in the neighborhood beside UL that's going to be known as the Gaines House, which is a huge honor, I imagine. And the writer in residence will live there for forever, whoever that person who fills the position will be. And we're also in discussions to start the Ernest Gaines Center and the library. And after spending 21 years at an institution, how does it feel to be honored like that? What kind of feeling is that to have, after your time is up, to be recognized with those kind of,
Well, it's a wonderful feeling. It's like receiving the honorary doctorate from the university today. To be recognized and thought of these honors, I think it's wonderful. I never expected these sort of thing. A house named in my honor or a center named in my honor. I've never thought of these things happening to me. So it's really great to have
Yeah.
it.
Especially from your background, I wondered if we could talk a little bit about your growing up in New Roads and then
Right,
your move to Vallejo.
Well, I grew up on a plantation, and I lived there in my first 15 years. And then when I finished the ninth grade, I didn't have a high school that I could go to in that area because there were no high school there for African American students at that time. So my mother and my stepfather who had gone to California during the war. I left here in 1948. I was 15 years old. They had gone to California during the war for work, and they sent for me. They had left me with my aunt, and then they sent for me to come there to further my education. But I came from the plantation south, where children went into the fields at 6, 7, 8 years old. They were working 8, 10 hours a day. And I did that, going to school about 5.5 months out of the year. So I went through all of that before leaving to go to California. And then I discovered a library in California and, discovered the love reading. And that's where I started trying to write.
Yeah.
Those days when I didn't have to go to class, the summers when I didn't have to go to school, I would end up just reading in the library all the time.
Yeah.
And then that's why I developed a love of literature and wanting to be a writer.
What drove you to the authors whom you read while you were beginning as a reader and a writer?
Yeah, well, I always look for books, novels, with certain titles like Earth or Trees or Water or whatever, because they reminded me so much of my Southern background. So if it were a Russian writing about the Earth or trees or water or Chinese, I read The Good Earth. I didn't know who wrote it, Pearl Buck had written it. But, and then of course American writers, Steinbeck and all these writers. If they mention peasants or work, field work and stuff like this, I would read that work because it reminded me of home, and I thought about my home.
Yeah. What writers influenced you the most? Who are maybe outside the African American tradition? Outside of the tradition, who influenced you the most?
Well, I early discovered the 19th century, mid-19th century Russian writers like Turgenev and Tolstoy and Chekhov. Especially Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. This guy was a doctor. His hero of the book is a doctor who comes back to the old place. He had gone away to go to school, and he comes back to the old place, to the village where his parents lived. And he was estranged from that world now.
Yeah.
And I came back to spend some time with my aunt, whom I left, to go to California. And I found that I was estranged from her and from my friends whom I had known, so that book was really played a very important part of my life when I was early age. And of course, this guy Bazaroff in Father and Sons meets a beautiful woman but loses her. And the same thing happens in my first novel. The guy meets
An
a
upper
beautiful
class
girl.
woman.
Yeah, right. And then loses her. So
Yeah.
all of these things. Writers are always taking from writers, and the best thing to do is to take from the best of writers, and Turgenev was up there with the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I learned from writers like that. Then I went to the French writers and de Maupassant and Flaubert, and trying to write the perfect sentence and all that sort of thing from Flaubert, and because I think I'd read somewhere that Hemingway had said something about Flaubert, and he also loved Turgenev. So I just read all of them. Read Hemingway, read Faulkner, read Steinbeck. I read Mark Twain, Willa Cather. Read them all.
Yeah. I've heard you often in interviews and in conversation call Faulkner your old man, or the old man.
But yeah, right.
What does a designation like that mean to you?
Well, I think as a writer, I think Faulkner had tremendous talent. Sometimes I didn't go along with his philosophy, but I went with his talent. But I don't know any writer of the 20th century compared to his talent. And he captured things in dialect and character that I could recognize from my part of the country, because Mississippi borders Louisiana, and much of the language is much the same. If you don't get caught up in the Cajun language, the Creole language, but a lot of the other characters, his characters would speak the same as mine, and they would do the same sort of work in the fields and things like that. So I think Faulkner influenced just most Southern writers since after he wrote his books.
It's a pretty tall shadow.
Oh yeah,
Try to
right.
climb
Yeah,
out from
a
under.
little short guy, but boy, he cast the biggest shadow in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, today you spoke at the commencement of a liberal arts university, and I was wondering what your educational background was like after you left Louisiana.
Well, I went to high school and a community college in Vallejo, California, and then when I came back, I enrolled at San Francisco State to study American literature and creative writing. So although the state taught other classes, well, this is the only thing I was interested in creative writing and American literature. After that, I won a fellowship to Stanford University, where I was taught advanced creative writing, and I had classmates like Ken Kesey and Wendell Berry and several other people in the class. I learned a lot from Wallace Stegner, because he's always bringing in great teachers and writers and critics. So he's bringing people in there. Malcolm Cowley was one, Stephen Spender, and different people like that is coming in there and they're giving lectures. So it was great. That's where I got a lot of experience from that, being there.
Yeah, and I remember you talking about how important that community was, that community of writers, with Stegner as kind of the leader, and how much young writers can benefit from having that leader.
You're right. Yeah, I think he encouraged us to talk and to be with each other after the classes were over. You'd go to a beer joint and drink a couple of beers, or just go to a restaurant, and sit around and talk. And of course, I tried to do the same thing when I was teaching at UL. 30, 40 years later, I was teaching them using the same technique that Stegner had used. that Socratic approach to teaching. You know, you get the paper out on the table, and everybody contributes to something, to criticizing the work. With the, I'm sitting at the head of the table. I'm sort of directing it, but I wanted you guys to do the discussion, because I think most of the writers were on sort of the same level. You know, they're writing different things, but they're sort of the same level. And I think that when you in a group like that, you can learn from one another. You know.
Yeah.
So that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah. When did you know in your writing career that you were going to be a Louisiana writer, even though you lived in California?
Right.
But you knew that you were going to be a
I
Louisiana.
couldn't think of being any other kind of writer. When I left Louisiana to go to California, I really didn't want to go. You know, I was forced to go because for education. But the body went to California, the soul remained in Louisiana. So when I started writing, my very first writing was about Louisiana, never about San Francisco. I tried writing about San Francisco. I tried writing about my military experiences. I tried to write bohemian stories, and nothing worked out.
Ghost stories.
Ghost stories. I tried to write ghost stories, you know, and nothing worked out. But I would always feel, much more comfortable writing the Louisiana stuff, and in most cases, the stories became more successful. I can handle that kind of material much better than San Francisco. But it was good to be around that kind of environment at that time for a young writer. Not to be around it all the time, but to be around, listen to lectures and being around other writers and doing the same work you were doing.
It's that balance, like you in the new book, Mozart and Leadbelly. You talk about that high-minded educational experience coupled with the more earthy rootedness.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
There's an author named Ron Rash who's from the North Carolina mountains. He's from Madison County, which is just northwest of here. And he writes about something he calls blood memory. It's a memory that he might not have experienced the same thing his ancestors experienced, but because of this family link, he has this blood memory. And I know you write about, especially with Miss Jane Pittman, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, you write about stuff that you could never have experienced because it happened centuries before.
Right, sure.
So how do you think something like blood memory affects your writing and being able to tap into the past and things that happened way before you in that area in Louisiana?
Well, I did a lot of research, and talked both in the archives at LSU, as well as talking to older people who lived in that area. And I also did a lot of letter writing for people when I was a young kid. 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, I used to write for these old people because none of them had ever gone to school. And I created their letters for them, and they were always talking about the past, talking about contemporary things as well. So that's where I got a lot of my education for and my knowledge of putting what I would put into my work later on.
What was it like growing up on River Lake in Shirley Quarters?
Well, it was a lot of hard work at time, and then other time it was a lot of fun. You know, you could run, you can play ball, you can run through the fields, you can hunt, you can fish out in the river or the bayous. But also you had to pick cotton, you know, and there's nothing tough on a child or anybody, you know, to try to put a cotton sack on your shoulder and pull this darn thing for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day picking cotton. So you had both the hard work as well as a lot of time to relax and to have fun. And you know, as I said earlier, that we're going to less than 6 months of school a year because we had to go into the fields, and also went into the swamps to pull the end of a hand saw out there to cut wood, because that was the only means of for the heating the house or to or cooking the food, you know. So but that's not only my experience. That was the experience of you know, the average boy who grew up on that place, a girl too.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and after living in California and traveling all over the world and living for a time in Miami with your wife, you decided to come back to Falls River,
Well,
where
what
you were
hap-
born and raised.
What happened was that the University, well, USL at that time made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and that it said you can teach one class from a semester, and you can teach it any way you want to teach it. You want to teach it one night a week, or you want to break it up in 2 nights. 1/2 hour on Tuesdays and 1/2 hour on Thursdays, or you wanted to break it up into 3 sessions, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, teach any way you want to. And they gave me a house to live in, and there were people there to cut the grass and to, do anything that I need to be done around the place. So of course I jumped at that chance because I was very low on cash at the time. I didn't have too much money. And after being there a while, I decided to, well, as I said earlier, that I always wanted to, my soul was in Louisiana. So it wasn't too difficult for me to, if I had any kind of money, to not live there. Some wonderful things happened when I wrote the A Lesson Before Dying. Oprah chose the book, and suddenly it shot up to the bestsellers list for quite a few weeks. And at the same time, we sold the right to the movies, so that got a certain amount of money. And my wife and I took that money and bought a piece of that property, that same plantation where I was born and raised, where my folks had lived for 5 generations. And well, you've been there several times. We built a house there, a very nice house there. We have a guest house there, a big lawn.
The church.
And the church where I'd gone to school in my earlier days. We moved the church on the property. So it was, I was back home again.
Yeah.
So that's why I am today.
Yeah. Well, you can't come to Asheville as a writer and leave Asheville without the obligatory Thomas Wolfe question about can you go home again?
Yeah, right.
And you're proof that you can physically, but emotionally and spiritually, how has it been coming home?
Well, it's been wonderful. I have some of my friends who I knew as a child. The community has sort of accepted my work. I have a good relationship still with the university in Lafayette. So it's been interesting, very wonderful to be back.
Here at UNC Asheville, we have a very strong creative writing concentration in the literature department. And in the case that some young writers are watching this now, what kind of advice do you have for young and beginning writers who are just starting?
I think you know my answer to that.
But I have to act like I don't.
Okay, right, yeah. Well, my advice is 6 words of advice, and to any young writer or anyone beginning to writing, and 8 words. And the 6 words are read, 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 and write, write, write. And 8 words are read, 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 write, 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 write. And I've always said that to to anyone who asks me, well, what should I do as a young, inspiring writer? I say, do a lot of reading. And not only the books that have been published post Katrina, but read the classics, read all the great novels, read as much as you possibly can. And after you do that, you sit down at that table or that desk or wherever you sit and spend hours and hours and hours of writing. And that's what a young, inspiring writer should do.
Yeah.
That's what you should do.
Well, fantastic. I think that's all the time we have for this. I want to thank you for meeting with me today.
Well, your questions were good. I don't know what my answers came out sounding like, but your questions were good.
Maybe you'll watch it back and you'll be pleasantly surprised. Say, man, I sounded smart.
I will not watch. I never watch any of yours.
I've been here with Ernest Gaines, who was the commencement speaker. He received an honorary degree at the May 2000 commencement of the University of North Carolina at Asheville. And I want to thank you again for meeting with me today and being here for us. It was a pleasure. All right, thank you.
At the University of North Carolina at Asheville, we are particularly pleased to be able to bring to our campus and to honor distinguished men and women in all fields whose work contributes to our society, our culture, and our understanding of each other. It is a pleasure for the University of North Carolina at Asheville to have the opportunity to share with our community some of the rich occasion that occurs on our campus in May when we delightfully celebrate the completion of study by students and the welcoming of these students into our alumni body. Thank you for joining us.